All right. I want to thank everybody for watching this right here, and welcome to Uncle Frank's Place. We have a very special guest today. We have Ronald K Fried. Is that how you pronounce your last name?
Fried, you were very close.
How do you say it?
Fried,
Fried. Got it. So I meant to ask you that before we got started, so
that's
I should
okay.
have done that.
I've been
But
living with it my whole life.
I'm sure. But so Ronald has written this excellent book that I can't recommend enough. Frank Costello, a novel, and it's a work of fiction, but it's kind of not a work of fiction. In fact, if I was going to recommend a book to somebody who wanted to get interested in the history of Frank Costello and maybe doesn't want to read something as dry as a lot of these kind of novels can, or the other books can be, I would recommend this because it's the research is amazing, and it's just such a good read. It's not as dry as a lot of these things that you come across. It just keeps you interested the whole time. So, Ronald, why don't you tell us just a little bit about your background first, and then how you came to learn about Frank Costello and write this book?
All right, thanks. Yeah, please call me Ron. I'm a television producer, and I started well, many years ago at the Dick Cavett Show. I've done all sorts of things on as a TV producer, but I've also been writing. So I wrote a book called Cornermen, Great Boxing Trainers. That's a history of old-time boxing trainers from sort of the early part of the 20th century. And that actually, it turns out, helped me with Frank Costello, which I'll explain perhaps later. And then I got a job working as a writer and producer, interview producer, on a docudrama about the history of the New York City Mafia, and I hadn't really known much about it before then. And then I got intensely interested in Frank Costello. It's just one of these crazy things. It's like having something stuck to your finger and you can't quite get it off, And then you think, so I've written two previous novels as well as that nonfiction book, and I thought, okay, I'm going to write this novel about Frank Costello. And what interested me most was this decision that he made to testify in front of the Kefauver Commission, which in 1951, which proved to be really bad for him, and eventually he was humiliated in public, and it sort of led to his being in prison. And I thought, well, why did he do that? That seemed like such an interesting decision, because many of the other top gangsters refused to testify, or they take the fifth, or they didn't. But because Costello, in addition to being essentially the acting head of the Genovese crime family, having succeeded Lucky Luciano, he was also in immense political power, right? He could appoint judges. He had control of who was the boss of Tammany Hall, and he was hobnobbing with congressmen, um, uh, city politicians, judges, and he thought, well, all his life he wanted to be legitimate, so he began to conceive of himself as a legitimate person, right? And so he thought, well, I'll just speak to these senators. And it was a terrible decision, because I think that my sort of thesis is that he was an immigrant and he wasn't educated. He's obviously extremely smart and extremely competent, but I don't think he really understood where he stood in society. And I don't think he understood how he was seen in society. And I don't think he understood who had the real power in America. And it was the establishment, it was the government, it was prosecutors, it was ultimately, the people who could put him in jail. And the senators had nothing but disdain for him, and were interested mostly they had a legitimate interest in exposing to the American public how incredibly powerful the mob was. There's nothing wrong with that. And they were interested in scoring political points, and they were interested in becoming stars on this brand new medium of television. And I think that when Frank agreed to testify, he didn't, but I don't think anyone understood the power of television. It was a new medium. A lot of people didn't have access to television. He didn't realize how powerful it would be, and it was very powerful. So it's one thing to be humiliated. Yeah, it's bad enough, but to be humiliated and to be laughed at on television is worse. And I thought, well, why did he do it? It seemed poignant to me. It seemed interesting to me, and it made him a fascinating character.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the reasons that I became interested in him too. It's just, he's a little different than your kind of run of the mill gangster, I guess,
Oh
racketeer.
yeah, yeah,
And,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
and I definitely agree with you about I don't think anybody had an idea of the power of television yet.
No,
He learned
no,
the hard way, and it was such a spectacle at the time. I don't
yeah.
People don't realize how many people were watching that. There wasn't anything else to do. It was everybody was glued to the television watching that. And
That they kept department stores in New York City open late because women who were the shoppers, it sounds very sexist, but that's how people thought, that's how the world worked in those days. They were at home watching TV rather than going out shopping. So they kept these big department stores like Mom would tell us stayed open late so that people could see it. And then people who didn't have a TV would go to movie theaters, and they didn't want to see the feature. They wanted to see the hearings. And, it was very dramatic, right? And this whole world was being opened to the American public of this thing called the mafia, right? Because J. Edgar Hoover, as we know, was not really interested in prosecuting the mafia. It wasn't. He didn't have the equipment to do it. There were no FBI uh, uh, agents who could speak Sicilian or Italian, so he had no way to infiltrate them. You're not going to get these straight Joes going in and pretending to be members of the mob. So it was a fantastically interesting moment. So in the novel, I try to trace backwards to see what led him to do it, and the stuff I found, what I discovered was that it was part of a pattern. Because I used many sources. One of them was a really interesting memoir by George Wolfe, who was Frank Costello's attorney. And early in the book, and I used this quote, Costello testifies in front of a hearing, uh, and he finishes, and his lawyer says to him, "You love to testify, don't you?" And he did. He liked the attention. He could be very good at it, and I, I, um, he liked to brag a bit when he did it, about his legitimate friends, about his contacts. Um, but of course, what he didn't realize is that there were a lot of things he really couldn't talk about, right? Like, where was the money coming from, Frank? And, do you know Lucky Luciano? Do you know Al Capone? And there's another moment I couldn't believe that I did when I sort of stumbled on this, that he was accused of being basically in charge of heroin importation to New York City. And so he holds a press conference. Right? This is the guy who is the head of the Judas Priest crime family. And he knew, because Frank Costello, beg your pardon, Al Capone in Chicago would talk to the media all the time, right? And that's not a good thing for a gangster to do, right? Because it makes you famous. You don't want to be famous. It's almost like poking your finger in the eye of the authorities. Nonetheless, he holds a press conference, and then he can't answer most of the questions. Is there a mafia? I can't say. Were you the biggest were you the slot machine king of New York? Well, I prefer not to say, And so it's sort of it's sort of ironic that he held a press conference, but he gave interviews. He gave interviews to Time Magazine, to Saturday Night Live, to Saturday Evening Post, et cetera, et cetera. Because he liked to talk, and he thought he could explain himself, and he thought he was good at it. He was good at it, but he couldn't really sustain the scrutiny that he brought upon himself. And that's that yearning to be legitimate that sort of makes his story poignant, really.